This presentation is brought to you by Nonprofit Accounting Basics, an educational project of the Greater Washington Society of CPAs Educational Foundation.
Hello, my name is Sean Miller. I'm a partner with Caliber CPA Group in Washington, D.C. Today we're going to talk about COSO. What is it? What has changed in the most recent update, and how it impacts you as either auditors, board members, nonprofit executives, and so on. A little bit of background on COSO. First of all, what is COSO? You've probably heard of it, but what is it? COSO stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. It was established in 1985 and was a sponsor of the National Commission on Fraudulent Financial Reporting. COSO's charge was to develop recommendations on internal controls for organizations of all sizes and shapes. In 1992, they issued their initial framework on internal controls. Again, you'll notice it took them several years to develop this, and we'll see why momentarily. Now, in 2010, the COSO began a project to update this framework. Obviously, it had been almost 20 years since the initial framework had been developed. Significant changes in the world and in the business environment led for the need for an update. They gathered representatives across the board from industry, academia, government, and nonprofits to an advisory council to provide input. They also changed the format of the framework, whereas now it's structured, there's an executive summary. The framework itself is quite lengthy and detailed. What they added, which I believe are the most helpful, are appendices that give you significant more information and clarification, and an application guide with tools, which allows you to figure out how to implement the COSO framework in your organization. So what is the framework itself intended to do? So there's pieces that for the board and management, what is it intended to do? It gives you a means to apply internal control to any type of entity. As we get into the COSO structure itself, you'll see you can apply this framework to organizations of any size, nonprofit, for-profit, governmental, and that's the main thing they wanted to accomplish, was come up with a standard universal framework. They provide a principles-based approach that gives flexibility. Rather than being a strict rules approach, they tell you what they want the controls to accomplish and allow you to figure out how to adapt those to your organization. Create a requirement for an effective system of internal controls. Give you a means to identify and analyze risk. The main focus of the COSO is to identify the risks and then develop the controls to address those risks. Again, the idea that not every organization has the same risks, but every organization has to identify their own risks and then determine how to address those risks. The new one gives an opportunity to expand the application of controls beyond financial reporting. Again, you'll see in what's called the COSO Cube, it addresses compliance issues, operation issues, not just financial reports, and then also provides management and boards, hopefully with an opportunity to eliminate ineffective and redundant controls. Because obviously having controls is one thing, making sure they function effectively and efficiently is another thing, and is in all likelihood even more important. So one other item is, what is it intended to provide for external users, right? So not for nonprofits so much, but for public entities, they have to provide a report on their application of COSO. And some nonprofits do also provide this report more internally to their board, but also sometimes to funders and donors. And what does it provide to them? And essentially it gives them confidence that the system of internal controls is functioning effectively, is designed in accordance with best practices and industry standard. So by providing a report onto your application of COSO, you give your donors and also your board members a little more comfort that you are running your operations appropriately and effectively. So why was there a need to update the 1992 framework? Right, so it had been in place for 20 years. Things seem to be going okay. So why the need to update it now? A few reasons. Obviously, some changes in the business environment, such as globalization. That was a big factor. increased expectations on governance. So whereas before, maybe you were on the board, it was almost an honorary position, you were a big donor perhaps. Now the expectations for governance are that you take an active role in monitoring the organization's internal controls, their compliance, and making sure they function the way they should be functioning. The impact of technology, I think that goes without saying that from 1992 to 2010, technology plays an exponentially larger role in not just the operations of an organization, but in the reporting and the communication, and then as such, the control process. And the demand for greater transparency. Transparency is a big buzzword we've heard for the last many years now, but between 1992 and 2010, that demand for people to really know what's going on in an organization grew tremendously. You'll remember Enron, Long-Term Capital, WorldCom. We had a string of financial scandals there in the late 90s, early 2000s that really led to people to say, well, maybe COSO isn't doing what it should be doing. So they came out with a much more expanded framework. So again, so in the 2010 update, there were some changes, but there's some things that didn't change. And essentially the core, shall we say, values of COSO didn't change. The core definition of internal controls, you'll see there, process affected by an entity's board of directors, management, other personnel divided to provide a reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives related to operations, reporting, and compliance. A couple things about this to keep in mind is right off the bat, it says a process. So keeping in mind that internal controls aren't something you write down in paper and they're just good forever, right? It's a process, it's an evolving process. You always have to be analyzing, do we have new risks? Did something change? Do our internal controls need to evolve or change in some manner? So it's important to remember that internal controls are a process. And the other piece that they've really expanded when we get into that a little bit is this concept of achievement of objectives. The idea that you can't know if your internal controls are functioning if you don't have proper objectives identified first. So whether that be safeguarding of assets, segregation of duties, timely financial reporting, whatever the objective is, that needs to be identified before you can then design the control related to it. And lastly, in that definition, you'll notice it's not just financial operations. It's operations, reporting, and compliance. So it essentially covers the full gamut of the organization. The COSO cube, which we'll see in a minute, remains unchanged. And the last piece that they emphasize throughout the framework that hasn't changed is an emphasis on professional judgment. Again, the internal controls and the risk analysis is all done by a professional judgment. It's not a checklist situation. They expect you, whether it be senior management or the board, internal auditors, external auditors, to look at something, analyze the risks, and then using your judgment, design the related controls. So what is the COSO cube? You'll see it there in front of you. And it's essentially a three-dimensional depiction of the internal control framework. Across the top, you'll see what's referred to as the objectives, whether they be operations, reporting, or compliance. Down on the front side, you'll see the 5 components of internal controls: the control environment, the risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. None of these have changed from the 1992 framework. And then on the side panel, you'll see the different levels within an organization. So is something an entity-wide control? Is it just applied to one division? They break that down into one unit or down into one function. So for example, when we get into control environment, we'll talk about setting the tone at the top and the right attitude. That's an entity level control. However, for function, we may have something such as all disbursements require 2 signatures. So that's a control related specifically to the function of cash disbursements. So you'll see how all these fit in to the one bucket or another in this cube. So what has changed? And again, the core values have not changed, but it's been expanded considerably. So for example, the codification of the 5 components, and specifically they have 17 what they call principles of internal control now. So the 1992 framework discussed these, and wanted you to adhere to them, but now they're specifically listed 17 principles of internal controls spread across these 5 components. Clarification that objective setting is a precondition to risk assessment. So as I mentioned earlier, before you can decide where a risk is, you need to know what you're trying to accomplish. Again, so if your objective is, safeguarding of assets, that's the objective. What's the risk related to that? If your objective, again, is compliance with all your grant laws and regulations, what's the risk there? Obviously, a reflection of the increased importance of technology on the control environment. And as we mentioned earlier, the enhanced discussion of governance, the expectation on those charged with governance to be more active in the internal control structure. Expansion of the reporting category. Again, now it's really clear that this does not just your external financial reports that either you're sending to donors, your audit, your 990 or so on, but it now includes internal financial reports management gives to the board and non-financial reports. Again, COSO, a lot of it is driven towards public companies, but this particular section, I believe, is equally important for nonprofits who produce a lot of program-related reports. Greater discussion of anti-fraud expectations. Again, that's such a big buzzword at this point. And again, increased focus on non-financial areas, which I think is very important, again, in the nonprofits sector, particularly related to compliance, whether it be federal grants, donors of private foundations, or so on. So we talked about this already, kind of what does the cube really mean? So you see this laid out a little more clearly. So now getting into the specifics of the kind of the COSO framework there. So as we talked about, there's 17 principles spread across each of the 5 components. And then the framework itself and the appendices now also include points of focus for each principle. So if you look at it, it's a layered effect, essentially. There's 5 components, right? Control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information, communication, and monitoring. Under that, there's the 17 principles, each principle being assigned to one component specifically. And then for each of these principles, there's then a point of focus, which is a more specific control. So I'll give an example here. So principle number 1 under control environment is the organization demonstrates a commitment to integrity and ethical values. Seems pretty straightforward. So then the 4 related points of focus are you set the tone at the top, you have a standard of conduct, evaluates adherence to standards of conduct, and address deviations in a timely manner. So the point of focus aren't intended to be a checklist, right? They don't want this to just be check the box and we're good, but they want it to function almost as a checklist. So you can say, all right, here are the 4 things I want to make sure happen, and if I can do all 4 of these, I'm comfortable that principle number 1 I'm going to adhere to. Some are easier than others, right? Setting the tone at the top is not something you can necessarily just check the box and say it's done, whereas establishing a standard of conduct, you have a policy, it's pretty easy to say that. So how is the framework used? So it's used both by boards and senior management. By the board, how are you going to use it and how are you going to apply it? 1, you need to ensure your board has the financial expertise to read the framework and understand it. Now, it may not be your entire board. It may be a subcommittee of the board, an audit committee that maybe you have some external people on who aren't board members but provide the necessary financial expertise. And the board needs to discuss with senior management the current system of controls. Establish the policies related to board oversight. What is it the board's going to get every month? Who are they going to be able to ask questions from? Are they going to be able to meet with the auditors and so on? And challenging management. Too often when you see something go wrong in the internal controls and you ask where the board is, you'll find out the board was essentially just rubber stamping things, not challenging management, not asking the tough questions. And the board should also have the ability and be encouraged to seek input from either internal auditors, external auditors, other professionals, attorneys, whomever. They should have free access to that group to ask any questions as they see fit. So what about for senior management? How do they use the framework? Again, you need to assess the system of internal controls. focus on the application of the principles and the points of focus, developing the internal controls, and the last piece is ensuring strict adherence to these controls. You can't have controls that are in place 50% of the time or apply to everybody but the senior level people. They have to be strictly adhered to across the board for them to be effective. And effective internal controls is really the ultimate goal, is implementing the COSO cube for effective controls. And one thing that the COSO framework emphasizes is these 5 components need to all work together in an integrated manner. That's why it's called the integrated framework. You can't look at each one individually, but you need to say, here's our system of controls covering all 5 components and all 3 objectives. How does that all work together? So that's something to keep in mind when you're assessing your internal controls. And also to remember that just because maybe one of your areas is not covered or you have a gap or deficiency somewhere doesn't mean your entire system is flawed, right? There's a concept of materiality you need to focus on. Again, when you do your risk analysis, if the control that's lacking is in a less risky area, it has less of an impact on your overall internal control structure. Just to wrap up, some places for some additional information. The COSO has its own website. You'll see it there, coso.org. The entire framework is there. The executive summary is available to download for free. The full framework and the appendices and illustrative tools you can purchase there. Have a lot of guidance. I just listed a couple other ones there that I think are important to read. A transition if you're already using the prior COSO framework. And then the final one that I think is interesting is COSO in the cyber age. So just how to address cyber risks. Again, a lot of this is geared towards public companies, but I think reading it, understanding the general framework and underlying values and objectives in the COSO are applicable to all organizations. Thank you.